Hi, Jim.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Excellent. And you?
I couldn't be better. Let me introduce this. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging His TV. You are James Traub, well-known columnist for foreignpolicy.com. And also, I guess, a John Quincy Adams fetishist or something, right?
I am. I am maybe the one member of the John Quincy Adams fan club.
Yeah, I've never met one before. So you've got this thing. I get these emails from you, and if I click on the link, they will lead me to something about John Quincy Adams, which you've prepared for our
Because I'm writing a biography of him, which will be coming out in about a year or so.
I see. So you're building the momentum. So I'm part of the base you're building. You're building your base.
My buzz, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll see what I can do. I noticed reading a recent installment, maybe today's, that when he was an incumbent running for president, he thought it was beneath the dignity of the office to actually campaign for president.
He didn't campaign when he was not the incumbent. Even in 1824, when he won, he refused to lift a finger in his behalf, and he adopted what he called the Macbeth policy, which is to say, if it were done, it will be done in the fullness of time, but I myself will not do it. And his friends said, that is stupid, and he said, I won't be president any other way.
Things have changed, haven't they?
So I gather, yes.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, we will all look forward to the biography. So, in terms of more contemporary events, we want to talk a little about Ukraine today. Yeah. I would like to talk a little about Iran. But first, this news flash that we're not aware of at the moment that I called, but it strikes me as so weird I want to mention it. So the U.S. has apparently indicted these Chinese officials that we think are involved in cyber espionage, or stealing, I think in particular stealing corporate secrets, not so much government on government stuff. But in any event, some sort of cyber mischief. My reaction is like, this is not a good idea. Because we obviously have officials who are similarly guilty. We do stuff like this. We did Stuxnet, for example. And if we want to set the precedent that any aggrieved nation can indict these people, which means that not only can they not travel to that nation, they cannot travel to the nations with which that nation has extradition treaties, right? I just don't. Do we want to? I don't get this. Do we want to start this fight?
Okay, but yes. So the problem is, of course, this sort of new moral equivalence that comes from the fact that we now recognize that we're doing things we never admitted we were doing before, and indeed, possibly the single most immediate foreign policy effect of the Edward Snowden revelations was that it totally destroyed any attempt by the United States to rebuke China for its massive program of cyber surveillance, because the Chinese could now laugh at us.
Right.
And so the question that it raises is, does that mean we should just accept that this is a kind of piratical world, and for us or anybody else to raise claims of piracy against another country is just ludicrous hypocrisy? Because if that's true, that means that cyber world is going to be really anarchic, because it's basically going to consist of everybody saying, hey, so what? You did the same thing to us.
Right, but it does seem to me if we're gonna do the alternative and say no, there must be norms and laws against this stuff that that people must abide by. It seems to me we have to first turn over a new leaf and announce that we're doing it. Right? I mean, you can't just be blatantly hypocritical and expect this thing to fly.
No, I think there are two choices. The two choices would be you accept the fact that everybody does this to everybody, and accept that one of the consequences is you can't go indicting Chinese people for doing something that seems all too similar to what you do.
Right.
Or you say, we will restrain, and after all, this is quite consistent with what the United States has been doing for the last 70 years by binding itself in all sorts of treaties, whether it's NATO or the United Nations or the World Bank or so forth, where you say there's a lot of things we could do in the world, but we're not going to because we think that we're safer in a world of international law and norms, which, by the way, brings us very usefully to Ukraine in a moment.
Does it ever?
And so therefore, yes, James Clapper, the head of national intelligence, is right in saying there's some increment of extra value to our national security and reading everything ever written by anybody in any electronic medium. But actually, in the end, we make ourselves less safe by doing it because we completely lose our standing when it comes to what other people do.
Right. Right. And in an age of transparency like this, it just seems to me you increasingly have to assume that everything you do will eventually come to light. I mean, it's the same technology that permits this pervasive surveillance that makes it likely that it will eventually come to light.
Think about Wikipedia before all this, after all. Now we know that diplomatic correspondence is not going to be diplomatic correspondence anymore. Right. It's going to eventually be publicized. That's really bad in terms of diplomacy, but that's the world we live in.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they could take greater pains to protect it, but this brings us to Ukraine in a couple of ways. First of all, there was a widely publicized, leaked taped phone conversation that, of course, played a role. But more relevantly, I'd say there is this issue of whether we are going to play by the rules we insist others play by. I mean, when Russia took Crimea, I was as outraged as the next person about the violation of international law, but I just didn't think we were in any position to complain about it, given that we, for example, invaded Iraq, which was a pretty plainly illegal war, and have done various other things that were illegal. And I said the same thing at the time, like, look, if Obama will say, okay, we're going to turn over a new leaf, we repudiate it all, then fine, repudiate our past sins, then fine, then he can get up on his high horse and Kerry can keep complaining about Russia violation of international law. But otherwise, I don't see how we can do that.
I don't really agree with you there, I have to say. I mean, I just noticed the other day that some Bahrainian parliamentarian rebuked the United States, saying, how dare you criticize our human rights record, Iraq? Well, if the only way that you gain the right to insist on rules of any kind is by having an unblemished record of rule observance, then maybe Denmark is going to be in the position of saying something to Putin or any other lawbreaker, but nobody else will. And so this is a case where distinctions really matter. The distinction between the way the United States, and for that matter, any Western country, comports itself, and a bunch of non-Western countries too, and Putin is really a radical one. And so, yes.
Well, wait, elaborate on that. I understand that Iraq is different from Crimea. For example, we got a couple 100,000 people killed. That's a difference he might point to in if we start highlighting differences.
Yeah, and so why couldn't he also say, you're the people who enslaved black people, and you're the people who murdered Indians. Well, we are. It's true. And so you can play this reductio ad absurdum game all you want.
Yeah, but that stuff is ancient history, Jim. Come on. I mean, Iraq it just happened, basically.
Yeah, okay. So it didn't obviously, Obama has every right to say, I have said publicly that Iraq was a terrible mistake. It would not be correct to say the United States conducts itself in a way where Iraq is the perfect emblem of what we do. It's actually not. And if you think about the way Obama, who we could criticize for lots of things, has nevertheless conducted himself on issues like, let's say, Iran, where he has patiently gone about assembling an international coalition in order to be able to isolate Iran on the principle that there were a set of rules embedded in the non-proliferation regime which we're all going to obey, and Iran is an outlier and a renegade and it has to be brought into that system. He's got a right to say that. He has comported himself in that way.
Well, first of all, actually, another thing we did with Iran is commit an act of war. The Stuxnet virus actually destroyed physical stuff. And if you destroy physical stuff in any other way with a kinetic weapon, we call it an act of war. In fact, our Defense Department has said we reserve the right to consider cyber stuff an act of war. So that was so I would not say our record is unblemished in Iran. But getting back to Iraq, Obama did not react the way you said. Obama tried to draw distinctions between Iraq and he didn't disavow Iraq. He said, okay, the U.S. did that, but that's different from Crimea. And I'm sorry, I just don't think that the differences on balance, when you consider all the differences, are of a truly kind of morally qualitative nature. I mean,
let's take a harder one, Bob, than Iraq. Let's take Kosovo. I mean, the fact is, the Russians don't cite Iraq; they cite Kosovo. They say, "How dare you, the West, not just the United States, criticize what the Russians did in Georgia in 2008 when they claimed they were coming to the rescue of these beleaguered republics full of Russian speakers in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And how dare you likewise in Crimea? Now, is that a fair analogy? If it's a fair analogy, then I guess it kind of renders the U.S. speechless. Now, I would say in the case of Kosovo, where there was a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing being conducted against the Kosovars, and the United States, more or less like in Libya, acted in such a way with, of course, its Western allies in order to stop that, I think that is a morally different proposition from this act of basically rolling tanks across, well, in this case, actually kind of rolling tanks off ships onto another country, which, of course, is not at all consented to your presence in order to be able to seize it for yourself. Now, if Putin had said, you know what, the Crimeans are not being allowed to express their opinions about what they want to be and who they want to be, and you have got to give them the chance to have some kind of referendum where they can express their wish for autonomy or whatever, no matter how much Kiev didn't like that, that would be right. That is different from actually invading a neighbor, which, by the way, doesn't happen very much anymore. Saddam Hussein did it in 1990, I'm sorry, and that was a really unusual thing, and the world quite rightly reacted to it.
Well, yeah, but I mean, to get back to Iraq, one thing that's true is that Putin annexed the country and absorbed it. Okay, so that's a distinction we can point to. He can point to the distinction, if he looks at Iraq, for example, that is nowhere near us. We don't have any historical connection to it the way Russia does to Crimea, and it's certainly not clear. We certainly didn't ascertain that a majority of the people were basically in favor of it, which actually seems to have been the case in Crimea. I mean, I don't think that election was untainted, but there was majority support. So you can, and again, we got 200,000 people killed and went in with a kind of force that ensured many, many deaths. So you can point, it's not that they're exactly equivalent. It's that both are egregious violations of international law involving invasion and occupation. And beyond that, you can quibble about the distinctions. But I am just so fed up of America's utter inability, of the foreign policy establishment in particular, to just kind of see the way America looks to people other than Americans.
I would pull back a little bit in talking about Russia and talking about Crimea to recognize that the way Russia is behaving towards Crimea is part of a much larger pattern of Russian behavior, which is to say to use various tools of extortion and threats and economic pressure and threats of military invasion in order to have its way in its neighborhood. Now, you could say, as in fact a bunch of Americans have as well, that's just how every country defines its national interest in its own way and pursues it in its own way. Russia has historically felt vulnerable in those countries which constitute a kind of corridor or space in between itself and Europe. It feels a need to neutralize them. Now, the fact is that is the way statecraft operated for most of the world of the modern nation state. It doesn't operate actually that way in a lot of other places now. It certainly doesn't operate that way in the West. It certainly aren't the set of rules that the UN and other institutions codify. So you can say either, don't be a hypocrite, let's face it, nobody behaves by these rules, i.e. Iraq, or you can say we do not want to live in a world where everybody decides exactly how they're going to defend their national interest. That's why we have these institutions. And
that's what I want to say. I oppose the Iraq War. I'm clean. I oppose the Iraq War. That's the world I want to live in. That's the world I want to live in. I'm just saying if America really wants to live in that world, and this latest, these indictments of Chinese officials suggest that we really want to live in that world, we've got to clean up our act. And I don't see the faintest signs of an insight about that dawning in the White House or anywhere else.
It's very interesting that you say that, because the close to the kind of central belief that Obama had when he entered the White House in 2009 was America must put a different face on its behavior. I am that face. And so if you think about all of these speeches and all of the things he did in that first year, they were all designed to do exactly what you say he must do, which is to say, the first day in office, who do they speak to? What newspapers and media do they speak to? Only the ones in the Arab world. The first big speech he gave was a speech in Prague calling for nuclear nonproliferation, to getting down to zero, global zero. Radical change in the world's rules. The big speech he gave in the Middle East was, of course, the Cairo speech, where he said, we must begin to acknowledge the other and not simply preach at the other. There is a relationship of mutuality between the okay. So that was his idea. Now, I would say it's turned out that you cannot win foreign policy in the same way you win elective office by beautiful rhetoric. And there's several problems. One, people to whom he was preaching actually didn't care about that language of mutuality, though I think you're saying it would be awfully good if he could speak it more. They said, solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. If you can't, who cares? And so he's actually been quite frustrated in his attempt to kind of redraw the grounds of American foreign policy. And on all sorts of the other issues, which I think you're thinking about, let's say Guantanamo, all sorts of war on terror issues, I think he has both suffered the opposition of Congress, can't close Guantanamo, Congress won't let him, and he's found out the world is just more complicated than he thought it was.
Well, and I'm also thinking about drone strikes, which is another thing that complicates his sermonizing.
Yeah, I would say that's another example where he never would have dreamed in 2009 that he would be thought of as the president of drone strikes. Right. And he has been, and I think you and I would, well, I'm not sure we would totally agree. I would say on drone strikes, it's not reasonable to expect that the United States will unilaterally disarm of a weapon that's so powerful. It is reasonable to say that first, it will be far more transparent about it than it has been. And second of all, it will limit its use based in the same way as we were talking before, that it may be successful, but it may harm you in the long run. Therefore, you better do a hell of a lot less of it, and you better really carefully define the circumstances under which you will use it. For example, in Yemen, we may be killing a bunch of al-Qaeda guys, but is it really helping the cause in Yemen? I'm not convinced it is.
Well, my position would be, at a minimum, we never use them in a country unless the government of that country explicitly, publicly asks us to use them. Because otherwise, it actually is technically illegal in international law. And that would be, that's the minimal amount of restraint I would expect.
You would have said that even though not using drone strikes along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border would have allowed al-Qaeda to organize and increase its forces and strike at us far more easily, nevertheless, since the Pakistanis wouldn't approve of it, we shouldn't do it.
I'm not sure I grant your premise that would have led to significantly more terrorism in the U.S., but even if it would, I would say yes, live with it.
We don't have any other way in Pakistan. In other places like Yemen, we do have an alternative way.
Yeah.
There we don't.
But at the same time, this tactic ensures that in the long run, these groups will probably more and more consider the United States the enemy. I mean, Yemen is a good example of something where the energy for that movement is largely about local grievances about the Yemeni government. But we have turned it into something that's more about the United States.
I'm actually not sure that's the case in Yemen. In fact, I think Yemen, it's a combination of, from the little bit I understand, never having been there, local grievances, and Yemen has become a place to which jihadis have migrated. In Pakistan, though, I think Pakistan's a very hard case because since the Pakistani army was not going to do anything about the Afghan Taliban with whom they are in league, since the United States clearly cannot put any boots on the ground there, really the choice was drone strikes or nothing. And the fact is drone strikes have been tremendously successful at decimating the leadership of al-Qaeda there and preventing them from being able to organize to the point now where that's not what al-Qaeda is.
And they've also been successful in making tons of people hate us, thus ensuring that jihadi recruiters will have crops of recruits for years to come.
I actually don't think that's the case in Pakistan.
I think it is.
Well, okay. I
think there's a lot of evidence.
A lot of time in Pakistan. I have not been in the northwest frontier. I have not obviously been in those no-go zones. But several things I know. One is that the Pakistani government has a huge amount invested in making the United States a hate object and will use any instrument they can in order to do so. They themselves actually were quite pleased at the American drone strikes, at least when they wound up hitting any of their own targets. I also know that the drone strikes are immensely more popular in the places where they happen than they are elsewhere in Pakistan. Because in the places where they happen, people actually believe they're getting rid of bad guys whom they fear and hate.
Oh, well, there's tons of places we could do that. There's bad guys in every neighborhood, and I guess we could endear ourselves to the people living right next door to them if we assassinated all of them. But I don't think that that's what our national security should be devoted to.
Neither do I. I'm saying in this case, when there's no alternative, it may have been right even if it caused some really bad consequences. Well, because I don't see an alternative.
I would just say, I mean, we didn't come here to argue about this, but the last thing I'd say, and then I'll give you the last word, is I think a judicious foreign policy when it comes to terrorism is going to have to be one that can actually tolerate a certain amount of short-term terrorism domestically if the only way to prevent it is to create more terrorism long-term. And the amount of actual terrorism on our soil, the number of deaths like per year from terrorism since 9/11 is just almost none.
So we're doing a good job. So apparently Obama's right.
But I would also say that, it's not like it's an existential threat we're facing. I don't think...
You're not considering the possibility that had he not done those things in Pakistan, we'd be facing threats from Pakistan.
It's total hypothetical. And again, I would say to some extent I would be willing to tolerate that, but it's a completely hypothetical assertion that they would have had some significant success here.
I just think we have basically stopped using drones in Pakistan. It's very rare now. The virulence of anti-Americanism, I think, will be very little affected by that. I just think there are a lot of countries in the world where regimes have decided that their chief source of legitimacy is going to be showing people that they are a force against the United States. The Pakistanis have been playing that double game forever.
Sure, but you got to ask yourself, why is that an effective rhetorical tool? I think we give them more assistance than is necessary. The other thing I'd say is, okay, well, if we pretty much stop drone strikes in Pakistan, the terrorism should start showing up next door any moment now, right? I mean, if this goes on for a lot longer without terrorism becoming suddenly a significant problem in the United States, that will cast doubt on the assertion that drone strikes in Pakistan are keeping it at bay, right?
No, I think several things. I mean, I don't know if that would happen. I certainly do think that if you think that Afghanistan is a problem, it would make Afghanistan worse because obviously those guys, their immediate target is Afghanistan. So I would not be happy at the complete elimination of drone strikes from the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. As I've said, I think these are things that have to be really sharply limited and deeply thought about, and they've been used too promiscuously. But I don't buy the argument that they inevitably will cause more harm than whatever good they cause.
Okay. So let's see. We said, you want to talk a little more about Ukraine in a more... I'm curious as to your take on where we are. There's been a lot of interesting stuff happening. Seems to me, for one thing, Russia has shown that they are really not very eager to invade eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, Bob, I don't think anybody, I mean, I think Putin made people for a second doubt what had been their assumption. Their assumption was Crimea, that's overdetermined. He's always wanted it. He's going to get it. It's really easy. It's low-hanging fruit. He's going to pluck it. I never thought, but then I began thinking, oh, I'm naive, that he would actually literally invade eastern Ukraine. I thought he would use all sorts of means to destabilize eastern Ukraine. So, and I think what he's done, I think that Putin has his own version of counterinsurgency strategy, where he engages in military tactics, but they're totally deniable because he sends over guys who are not wearing Russian uniforms. They don't actually launch attacks. They basically work with local actors in order to be able to gin up local anger and have the deniability that has nothing to do with Russia once suddenly guys have taken over the police station and seized weapons and so forth. He's done that very, very adroitly. So the 40,000 troops that he had on the border were certainly designed to make the Ukrainians fear that such an invasion would happen. They were designed to fortify the spirit of local actors, but maybe they were never designed as an invasion force. We don't know. It certainly did what he wanted to do. But I think, the question that we can't answer now, and I think the big question about Ukraine is, has this guy bitten off so much more than he can chew? And is he so exaggerated how much he can chew? That is Russia's absorptive capacity as an economy, that he's going to really regret it. I mean, my feeling is it's really hard at a moment like this to think about what the consequences are going to be 2 or 3 years from now. I think the consequences 2 or 3 years from now are going to be really bad. I only hope the consequences for what I consider to be the good guys, which is to say the Ukrainians, and above all the Ukrainians west of the Dnieper River, aren't so horrible that everybody suffers as a result of Putin's manipulations. You know, we don't know that. I mean, I do think that, I mean, maybe I'm just getting, you know, Arab Spring fever again 3 or 4 years later. That you know, Ukraine is a country that can go a couple different ways, and the spirit of the square, the spirit of the demonstrators, is a one that we can really recognize as a European one. And I hope that Western Ukraine will be able to slowly pull itself out of decades of corruption and mismanagement and this and that and all sorts of bad stuff, which are going to make it a terrible next few years, and actually begin to kind of, you know, become a more democratic and prosperous country. I don't think that's a preposterous hope, though I recognize it's hardly a probable one.
Yeah. I mean, as for the spirit of the square, I think there was a lot of European spirit there. I think we read a little more of that into it than there may have been. There were other elements as well that are not so savory that were part of that. And in the end, they did basically chase a democratically elected president out of office who apparently feared his life at the time. So there were armed militias roaming the streets. But
but let's also, before we picture it that way, let's also remember that these dictators traditionally behave in such a way that they create a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. That is to say, with sufficient provocation, you can make your otherwise peaceful opposition begin to take up arms out of embitterment and despair. The extreme example of that would be Assad in Syria, who basically took a political protest and turned it into a terrifying sectarian civil war by virtue of his own very conscious tactics. So yes, it brings the opposition down to your side, down to your, level.
Yeah, I mean, I think Assad is a much clearer case, or a much more extreme case for sure. But the thing I'd say about Putin is, I think in a way his bluff has gotten called, if it was a bluff. I mean, I don't know if he was thinking about maybe invading, or he considered it a bluff all along. And of course he could still do it. But I think, you know, as ham-handed as Kiev's attempts to intervene in eastern Ukraine have been, you know, they'll try to take a police station and they wind up having to like burn the whole thing down and kill people. You know, those things have not been very deftly done. And also the more, I guess, possibly more popular kind of atrocity in Odessa, where they burned a building with a bunch of people. As ugly as those things were, I think they maybe sent a message to Putin that this isn't going to be like Crimea, you know, and I think there's a chance that has been a factor in his thinking. But in any event, I'm a little more optimistic than I was about just sheer stability, just stability of transition as opposed to civil war or something. I mean, leave aside the invasion. There could not be an invasion and still be a civil war that's covertly abetted by Russia. And I'm more optimistic about neither of those things happening.
What about the economic blackmail? The part that we haven't figured into this yet is Gazprom is basically doubling and quadrupling the price that not only it is charging, but claims to have retrospectively charged for natural gas to the Ukrainians. There is not enough surplus natural gas out there for us Western good guys to say, hey, look, we're going to step into the breach. And so I think that ultimately Putin's real big tool here is, you know, you're going to freeze in the dark. And so my fear would be that these other instruments not working very well, he'll basically have Ukraine by the balls when it comes to natural gas.
Well, I think, I mean, what I envision when I talk about a stable transition, I imagine him eventually getting something that he wants in terms of greater autonomy for Eastern European provinces or something. So I don't think he's going to come away empty-handed.
He doesn't want that. He wants Ukraine to not have the partnership with the West, which a Kiev-based government is going to seek. And I think he's going to go to great lengths. The autonomy for Eastern Ukraine, that's just his way of claiming that he wants something legit. He wants Ukraine to be in the Russian sphere, not under the Russian thumb in the sovereignty sense, but in the Russian sphere, not in the Western sphere. And for a long time, it was ambivalent. Now it seems like it's going to be one or the other. Yeah, and that's going to be real. That's my point about Putin's
No, but I see the autonomy as a way of getting those other goals from his point of view. So, for example, if these provinces could veto treaties, then Ukraine would never join NATO, for example, and he would like that. If they could veto economic treaties, similar effect. Well, as for the economic ties, I don't think it's so much that he's unalterably opposed to Ukraine having a close relationship or even being in the EU, so long as that does not preclude the close ties with Russia. And by the way, the EU did force that choice on Ukraine, and maybe it's built into the laws of the EU, but the EU said, no, you can't have it both ways. You can't have the economic relationship with Russia in terms of tariffs and everything that Putin wants you to have and be a member of the EU. That happened early on, and I think we may need a more creative approach to that problem.
Well, yeah, in retrospect, you may be right. I think the issue was whether or not Ukraine could join this EU-like organization that Putin has created.
Right.
And the Ukrainians themselves, the Kiev-based Ukrainians, were violently opposed to that. To them, that symbolized everything that they didn't want. So I don't know whether that's because you had ham-handed bureaucrats in Brussels, or it's because for the Ukrainians wanted to make that choice. They wanted to choose Europe and not Russia. And of course, the Europeans in their partnership agreement wanted them to choose Europe and not Russia.
Yeah.
And so Putin has said, you can't do that. It was just, Georgia is very similar. Putin saw Georgia as a zero-sum problem. You're either going to be with them or you're going to be with us, as George Bush would have once upon a time put it. And so Putin came down, with his fist on Georgia, in the hopes of keeping them in his orbit. Didn't work.
Yeah, but in the case of Ukraine, it was the EU that said him or us.
The Ukraine and
Ukraine
agree. Though again, in a rather modest way. I mean, it was just they had this partnership agreement. But I think Putin thinks in 19th century sphere of influence way that you're with us or you're not with us. That is not the sort of new globalized way of thinking.
Well, we have thought in a 19th century sphere of influence way, well beyond the 19th century in America. I mean, we invaded Grenada, for God's sake. So this isn't like totally alien to our way of thinking, to think in terms of a sphere of influence. I mean, our sphere of influence has never been challenged. We have asserted it. It's never been challenged. If it was, we can hardly guarantee that we wouldn't get it. I mean, we have taken the most remote challenges as grave, Grenada being a good example. So I don't know. I'm not,
I would have said the United States took many decades to wean itself away from its Monroe Doctrine view, though it has now pretty much done so. You're right. Grenada is not a happy example that way. There was a time in the 1920s and 1930s when the United States would simply send the Marines in if United Fruit had a problem in the Dominican Republic. That's more or less the way Putin behaves. It's not fair to say that's the way the United States behaves. It doesn't.
Well, we never face a threat like we don't have the Warsaw Pact offering membership to Canada, okay? We don't have a comparable threat.
Pardon me. Why, to what exactly is it a threat? Why does Putin define Ukraine signing a partnership agreement with the EU as a threat to Russia's national interest? Was the Ukraine going to stop buying oil and gas from Russia? No, of course not.
No, I'm talking about the whole pattern of bringing border countries bordering the Russia into NATO.
Why is that a problem? First of all, they weren't being brought in. We're talking about the EU, NATO. But
look, we were not even able to settle for a situation where NATO's borders didn't expand toward Russia. I mean, why was that a problem for NATO's borders to be where they were? Why did we have to push them toward Russia? Russia could say, why was that a problem for you?
Well, Bob, to what extent do we think that the wishes of those countries themselves matter? I would have said
I don't think we have any obligation to offer to honor the wishes of those countries.
No, but what I'm saying is that a more democratic view would be these countries should be able to elect with whom they ally and associate. And if Russia behaved in a different way,
sure, I'm not defending Russia's behavior. I don't think you should behave that way. I don't think we should behave that way. I'm just saying it's not clear we wouldn't behave that way if we saw the forces arrayed around us that are comparable to the forces he sees.
Well,
and we just, you know, I don't think we're very good at putting ourselves in the shoes of other people and understanding like why stuff freaks them out.
Okay, you know, it's good that China, for example, doesn't have quite the same territorial view that Russia does. They obviously are now asserting themselves in the South China Sea. They're not asserting themselves territorial in the same way. They feel like they have this powerful economic machine. They don't have to worry about crushing the sovereignty of countries because, frankly, those countries can't live without China because it's such an economic powerhouse. Russia, having failed to be able to use those kinds of more soft powers, depends a lot more on hard power.
Right.
And I think that's a sign of Russia's failure.
It is.
And so,
of course, this whole thing is a sign of Russia's failure. I mean, you know, nationalist fear is, at this point, the only thing Putin has to offer to people.
So then we're agreeing that we understand why he behaves, why he behaves the way he behaves. But that's quite different from saying we accept not just the logic of it, but the legitimacy of it. I say I accept the logic, but not the legitimacy.
No, I don't accept the legitimacy of it. I just think I'm just saying I don't accept the legitimacy of a lot of stuff we do that is in some ways comparable.
Well, we're disagreeing about the comparableness of it. I agree.
Grenada, I mean, you know, I don't know. It's...
This is a little bit on the order of iceberg, Goldberg, what's the difference?
Well, you mean Grenada was a little dinky thing we didn't spend much time in. But the point is it showed the same acuteness of sensitivity to threats that aren't really threats.
Yeah, well, thank God we're not in the Cold War anymore.
Well, thank God we're not in Russia's shoes is my point. Thank God we're not in Russia's shoes and can't, you know, and we have this huge comfort zone surrounding us.
Well, okay. I mean, I just think that Putin has chosen to behave in such a way, just as Saddam Hussein chose to behave in such a way, as to throw a challenge in the world's teeth. And the world can either say, you know what, we might do the same thing if we were in your shoes, so who are we to judge? Or the world can say, you know what, the rules of the road that we try to abide by with all of our failures are absolutely indispensable. And if we allow them to get away with this stuff, we will have really made the world a more chaotic place.
I am the leading evangelizer for rules of the road. I've been harping on international law for decades. The difference between me and most people who do it is A, I'm not doing it sporadically, and B, I insist that we abide by the rules too. And once we start doing it, then I will endorse our preaching.
Okay, we are a way more rule-abiding nation than Russia is for all of our.
We're not very rule-abiding nation. I mean, between Iraq, drone strikes, Stuxnet, you know, we're all over the place, and that's just in the last 12 years.
Okay.
And you know, I'm not saying we're not worse than Russia, but it's you know, you just can't consistently and without apology violate international law in ways that everyone sees and then go around complaining about people violating international law. I don't understand people who say you can do that. I don't get that.
Well, okay, then I think you're saying until we bat 1,000, we can't hit.
I would like us to bat 3. I would just like us to take it seriously today. Just this day, look at the things we're doing that everybody knows about, like drone strikes, and ask ourselves whether they are consistent with international law. And
if they are consistent with international law, I think that they're just an imprudent policy. I don't see what's inconsistent about international law with them. That's a separate. Anyway, I think we should move on from that. But
okay. Let's talk about Iran. What do you think the world would be like if I mean, this deal isn't looking. It's looking far from assured to me right now.
Sure.
But what would you say the world, if you imagine the deal happening and slowly Iran coming back into the world, with engagement with the Western world, like, would that be a good thing or a bad thing?
Sure. I mean, I think it would be a good thing. I think this is the fantasy of the Obama administration right now. I think when you tax them with things like, why are you failing to act in Syria? One thing they'll say is, first of all, because we can't do anything that's going to disrupt the possibility of reaching a deal in Iran. and serious intervention in Syria, we would lose the Iranians as well as the Russian pressure on Iran. Second, they think this is the way to bring Iran into compliance with all sorts of forms of good behavior, including in Syria. Now, I think that's probably a fantasy. I don't think that's much of a pretext for the failure to act in Syria. But it's clear that is the hope. Now, so the hope in Washington is sign deal, Iran becomes more compliant. One of the reasons why there's such a big rift between the United States and its Gulf allies is that folks in the Gulf who don't really care about Iran's nuclear weapons, they care about Iran's revolutionary disruption of the whole region and the promotion of a Sunni-Shia war. They want the opposite. They say, you shouldn't sign a deal with Iran until Iran has agreed to restrain its behavior in Syria and elsewhere. That's never going to happen. So if anything's going to happen, it's going to happen the way the administration foresees it. Now, is that going to happen? I don't know. I mean, I think first the premise would be you get the deal. You get an actually comprehensive deal. As of now, what seems much more likely is a kind of half-assed deal that both sides can live with, in which Iran does not, in fact, agree to go from 50,000 P2 modern centrifuges down to 5,000 P1 older centrifuge, but something in between where they have seriously diminished their so-called breakout capacity, and the U.S. and the EU then agree to relax a series of sanctions, and we both say we're still working towards a final agreement, but God knows when we'll ever get there. That is not going to lead to big changes in Iranian behavior. Only a final agreement, which really says to the Iranians, okay, the regimen you've been living under for all these years is over. You are now a member of the world community. Now, is that going to lead to a change in Iranian behavior? God knows. I mean, remember, this is a country that has so many different centers of power, right? And so Rouhani is going to get huge credit if this succeeds. But does that translate into the Ayatollah saying to the Revolutionary Guards, you know what? This guy has shown me he's right. We got to go a different way. Well, A, none of us know that. That's utterly opaque. And B, it seems unlikely. So, I mean, the leadership class of Iran still defines itself so profoundly as a revolutionary culture and a set of revolutionary organizations that to say, behave as a status quo citizen of the region, that's really hard.
Yeah. So you just see at this point the regime gets too much energy for what we consider its misbehavior, or from what we consider its misbehavior. I mean, its political identity is tied in with being seen as allied with Hezbollah and so on.
Yeah, it's a revolutionary force, not a status quo force. It's like what the amazing thing is, it's like the French Revolution until 1796 or something like that. But this is 35 years later. I mean, who would have predicted that 35 years later, their self-identity would have been so bound up with the revolution, and yet it is so.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like Putin. It's like the worse things go domestically, the more you rely on these kinds of things for your political support. The more you rely on hostility toward outside powers that are seen as threatening and so on.
Well, if that's true, then that's a hopeful thing in a way, because then you'd say, if in fact we do reach a meaningful agreement on nuclear stuff, then a lot of the air goes out of the oppositional thing, and Iran is more prepared to re-enter the circle of nations. That could be so. I don't know. Nice thought.
Yeah, I don't know either. But I hadn't thought about a kind of a partial
that's quite
lingering deal as you're sort of imagining. I mean, the big question.
One thing we should add, I just don't want to forget this. The Saudis invited the Iran's deputy foreign minister to come to Riyadh last week.
Right.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because that implies two things, I think. One, the Saudis have realized they're backing themselves into a corner. Saudi Arabia has been speaking in this uncompromising, self-righteous stance, hostile towards the U.S., insisting on their prerogatives, etc., and hasn't really done them a whole lot of good. Iran seems to have been kind of winning that battle, but the Iranians seem to have accepted that when that olive branch was handed to them, and it's a very frail olive branch, they quickly said, okay. And Iranian diplomats in recent weeks and months have been making little noises about that, which I think is what the Saudis responded to. Mm-hmm. So maybe also we shouldn't only think about what happens between the U.S., the P5+1, and Iran. We should also think about what's happening inside the region.
Right, but the other of our allies in the region that has been lukewarm at best about a deal is, of course, Israel. Where do you see the opposition coming from? I mean, of course, the official line is Iran is an existential threat, and the deals you're talking about would not ensure that they would not get a nuclear weapon. But it's a little more complicated than that, right? Whatever's going on in Bibi Netanyahu's head probably has more dimensions than that.
Yeah, though even, there's some Israeli liberals whom I have heard who don't like Netanyahu at all and who think he's dead wrong on Palestinian issues, who share this existential word, and they just think this is American naivete. You don't live in a dangerous neighborhood. We do. You don't get it. We do, right? So that's real. Now, my sense is, as a matter of what's possible, any agreement, any meaningful agreement between the P5+1 and Iran, I think makes it impossible for Israel to act militarily unilaterally, any kind of agreement. Mm-hmm. Certainly a really substantial agreement. If it's a half-assed agreement, you can imagine that the pressure inside Israel would actually build up because they would say now there's no one except us to stop the Iranians because the West has basically signed off. If there's no deal, of course, then, this is what Israel has been waiting for, and then they feel like they can go to Obama and say, okay, you've got to act with us to take out Iran's nuclear capacity, even though that would be the stupidest idea in the world.
Right. Well, if it's a thoroughgoing deal, I mean, the deal as imagined now would involve not only the continued monitoring of nuclear facilities, but this thing called the Additional Protocol to the NPT, which would allow, as I understand it, like off-site inspections, and so would provide. Not
only that, it also allows inspections with no prior warning.
Right. So it would give Israel a greater degree of confidence that breakout wasn't happening. Mm-hmm. So whatever the breakout cycle, whether they're saying, okay, this would give them only a year to develop a nuclear weapon or whatever, the point is that whatever the time that time segment would be implied by whatever deal they arrived at with however many centrifuges spinning, those provisions would presumably make breakout a whole lot easier to detect. And I think that's one reason it would be hard for Israel to bomb.
Oh, yeah, but I think, you presented the best case scenario. And of course, in the best case scenario, then Israel can live with its own anxiety. Yeah. But there are many, many, many things in between the best case and the worst case scenario. And just as a matter of logic, it is most likely we will wind up at something in between the best case and the worst case scenario. And then who the hell knows?
You mean in terms of the deal we get?
Yeah, I'm right. I just think
both. Yeah, but I kind of think that Iran is at a point now politically where, it's like what we've given them so far in terms of sanctions relief has not been that massive, hasn't made a huge difference. Right. I think if they don't get some pretty substantial sanctions relief as part of this deal, it's going to be hard for them to politically to keep being perceived as kind of on the leash of America, and smiling and welcoming these inspectors and so on. That's why I kind of almost think it is more binary than you think it is. That either we do a pretty substantial deal, or maybe the whole thing falls apart. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
No, look, that's perfectly plausible. I just think that there are these conflicting imperatives on both sides. Both sides really, really, really need to reach a deal. Yeah. Both sides also really, really have intransigent parties who are not going to accept the deal or who are going to be really hard to get to accept that deal.
Right.
The collision of those two forces on both sides is what makes me think that you're going to wind up with the half-assed halfway deal, which will never present itself as being a final deal. It will always say this is just a temporary road to where we hope to get to, but we could well be stalled for a long time in getting to that final deal.
Yeah. Well, could be. I mean, one of the problems is that the final deal requires Congress to actually repeal sanctions legislation.
And by the way, the EU unanimously, right? Every country's got to appeal every sanction, not just Congress.
Yeah, although I think that's an easier haul.
I'm not sure. We think so because we think they're not nuts like the Republicans are.
Yeah,
it could be very hard.
But there's also leverage you can usually apply to small nations. I mean, NATO in theory works by consensus, right? But we've seen that often, not always, you can forge consensus one way or another through.
Except on NATO, if you think about the fact that, for example, some NATO members refused to join the coalition in Libya, it didn't matter. You just didn't have those guys' planes in the air.
That's true.
This case, they actually have to vote yes.
Yeah. Well, we will see.
The big obstacles, really big obstacles.
We will see. These are interesting times. Anyway, I'm cautiously optimistic about at least stability in Ukraine, which I was not a week ago. And I still think there's at least a 50-50 chance of the big deal with Iran.
Yeah, I've had a bet with a friend. His bet with me was, of all these things that John Kerry is seeking, Syria, Iran, Israel, Palestine, which is the least unlikely? And I agree with you. I've always in the beginning said Iran is the least unlikely, Israel second, Syria last, and we'll still see. I still think that's about how it looks.
I think that's about right. So I guess we can leave it there. When is your book on John Quincy Adams coming out?
I probably have to finish writing it first, but I mean, if I would...
I've read books that looked as if that had actually not happened.
So I'm hoping if I have it done by like October or something like that of this year, then it will come out either just before or just after the summer of 2015.
Uh-huh. And do you have a title? You don't have to talk about it if you do. Title like John Quincy Adams, for example?
I want to have his name in there somewhere so people don't think it's about the father, though I probably should make them think it's about the father. My working title in the proposal had the word militant spirit in it. It was a phrase he'd used about himself.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't come up with a better one since then, though I've never gotten a good title until very late in the game for any of my books. So I don't know the answer yet.
Okay. Well, I will keep reading your JQA emails in the meanwhile.
Thank you.
And thank you for doing this, Jim. I think we've solved all the world's problems.
Pretty much. Or whatever we haven't, we'll leave for next time.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Well, thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.